December 17th, 1944. The Hawaii Thera. Honsfeld, Belgium. The Tiger's engine coughed, faltered, and quit. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist on the turret hatch. The metallic ring cut through the pre-dawn dark. His driver, an Unterscharführer named Fauber, worked the starter to wake the 700-horsepower Maybach. Nothing. The needle sat on empty. From the driver's compartment, Oberpanzermann Fauber shouted, tight-voiced, close to panic, that the reserve tank was dry, too. Peiper climbed out of his command tank, his boots scraping over the frozen Belgian ground. Around him stood the biggest armored spearhead the Wehrmacht could field for Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive, stopped cold by a lack of fuel. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, nearly 5,000 Waffen-SS troops paralyzed by empty tanks. Through the morning mist, Peiper could make out an abandoned American post ahead. Honsfeld, a key supply point for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had pulled out so fast they left fires burning in oil drums and coffee still hot in steel mugs. And there, laid out as if the war god had made an offering, stood row after row of cans, thousands of them, the olive-drab American jerry can. Peiper walked up slowly, almost with reverence. His edgy platoon leader, Hans Skruller, cracked a can, sniffed, and grinned. High-octane aviation blend. Men burst into motion, refueling in a rush. Peiper paced the stacks and counted. The total stunned him, 50,000 gallons, enough to push his whole column to the Meuse, maybe enough to change the offensive's fate. The Americans had left more gasoline at this forward dump than some German divisions saw in half a year. But as he watched American fuel pour into German tanks, a hard truth hit him. If the Americans could walk away from what Germany would guard with entire divisions, the war was already lost. Germany hadn't just miscalculated, it had misread the enemy. 6 months earlier, in June 1944, Hitler's armaments chief, Albert Speer, had handed the Führer a report that should have killed any offensive plan. Allied bombers were tearing apart Germany's synthetic fuel, the Wehrmacht's lifeblood. Lohne produced 175,000 tons in April. By September, it managed barely 5,000. Pölitz, Blechhammer, and Brooks ran at under 10%. The numbers told one story. Defeat was baked in. In 1944, the United States pumped 1.8 billion barrels of crude. Germany, counting synthetic fuel and captured Romanian oil, managed 33 million, under 2% of the U.S. total. The Reich was trying to wage a mechanized war with horse-drawn logistics. While America flooded its armies with petroleum, Major Friedrich Simmon calculated the Ardennes drive would need 4.5 million gallons to reach Antwerp. Hitler allotted 5 million. Transport snarls meant only half reached the start line. German planners built the entire attack on taking enemy fuel, an admission of weakness, not strength. By then, the Americans had pipelines racing across France, PLUTO hoses under the Channel, and the Red Ball Express, thousands of trucks hauling 12,500 tons a day. By December 1944, U.S. forces in Europe burned 1.2 million gallons daily and received 1.4 million, stockpiling even while fighting. Joachim Peiper wasn't naive. At 29, he was among the youngest Waffen-SS regimental commanders, a Knight's Cross winner with oak leaves and swords, an Eastern Front veteran who had learned that modern war runs on fuel more than ammo. His Kampfgruppe was the Schwerpunkt, the decisive thrust of the entire offensive. On December 14th, 2 days before H hour, he joined the final briefing at Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, boss of the 6th SS Panzer Army, didn't sugarcoat it. Seize American supplies, enough fuel to reach the Meuse. Peiper's official issue was 31,000 gallons, about 80 kilometers of combat movement. The Meuse was 105 kilometers away. Failure was in the math. Before moving on December 16th, Peiper laid down strict rules. Tanks would drive in single file to save fuel, shut engines off for any halt over 5 minutes. American fuel dumps took priority even over tactical targets. The contrast with the Americans was stark. That same morning, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 703rd Tank Battalion, just 32 kilometers from Peiper's start point, wrote in his log, "Received 8,000 gallons resupply. Third delivery this week. Storage already full." December 16th, 1944, 05:30. The German opening bombardment for Watch on the Rhine burned more shells in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had budgeted for entire early war campaigns. Even that display hid fatal shortages. Peiper's column rolled at 0700 and was behind schedule immediately. Roads drawn as highways on German maps were actually narrow country lanes, many all unpaved. Within hours, traffic jams built as vehicles designed for the Russian steppes crawled through Ardennes woods. At Lanzerath, their first objective, they hit a surprise roadblock, a single U.S. reconnaissance platoon, 18 men who stalled the strongest German column for nearly 10 hours. Engines idled and drank precious gasoline. When they finally broke through and reached Honsfeld at dawn on the 17th, they had covered 20 miles and burned 40% of their fuel. At that rate, they would run dry well before the Meuse. Honsfeld wasn't even a main U.S. site, just a forward Class 3B dump for the 99th Division. Yet what Peiper saw there beat a Panzer Division's monthly ration. Squad leader Hans Gruner later said, "There were pyramids of 5-gallon cans 3 meters high, stretching maybe 200 meters. The Americans hadn't even tried to destroy them. The haul was Avgas mixed with 80-plus gasoline. German engines, especially finicky Tiger Maybachs, were tuned for 74 octane. The American blend was actually too good and caused problems in several vehicles. As refueling went on, more finds appeared. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman, who could read English from pre-war work in his father's import firm, found freight manifests in the depot office. The papers showed the fuel's route: Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, across the Channel to Normandy, and 400 miles inland to Honsfeld, over 6,000 miles in under 6 weeks. "I showed them to Peiper," Hoffman recalled in 1976. "He read them twice, crushed the sheets, and went pale. We both knew what it meant." Private Ernst Kara found Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, only 2 days old, headlining a new pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, pushing 300,000 gallons daily. One pipeline moving more per day than Kampfgruppe Peiper would use in the whole operation. To grasp the shock, picture Germany's fuel state in late 1944. Allied bombs had cut synthetic output by 90% since May. The Luftwaffe sat grounded for lack of avgas. Flight training fell from 250 hours to 60. The surface fleet was effectively idle. U-boats snorkeled on batteries to save diesel. At home, private driving had vanished since 1942. Gasoline was so scarce the Gestapo chased black market theft by the liter. Farmers went back to horses. Meanwhile, the U.S. produced 67% of the world's oil. The East Texas field alone outpumped all German-occupied Europe. Refineries ran so hot that Standard Oil tried new byproducts simply because crude was surplus. Fueled by Honsfeld's 50,000 gallons, Peiper pushed on. By midday on the 17th, they reached Büllingen and grabbed more supplies, rations, ammunition, and, crucially, maps to other fuel dumps. The maps revealed a sobering pattern: fuel everywhere, a depot at every major junction. First U.S. Army alone had 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Peiper moved toward Ligneville, where his men carried out the Malmedy massacre, killing 84 American POWs. Even that atrocity touched fuel. Peiper later claimed he couldn't spare gasoline to haul prisoners. That evening, the spearhead reached Stavelot, where a massive American depot held more than 2 million gallons, enough to guarantee the Meuse. German vehicles closed in. American engineers were already acting. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had orders to deny the enemy the fuel at any cost. The Stavelot site held 2,189,000 gallons, stacked over 15 acres. At 16:30 on December 17th, as Peiper neared, Brewster gave the word. Engineers poured gasoline trails between stacks and tossed white phosphorus grenades. Technical Sergeant Paul Salas threw the first. The blast was instant and huge, he recalled. A wall of fire shot 100 feet up. Minutes later, the whole dump was an inferno. Peiper's lead tanks arrived under a 1,000-foot pillar of smoke. The fire burned 3 days, enough fuel to take his division to Antwerp and back. Unterscharführer Faulber said, "The commander stood on his turret and watched. For about 5 minutes he said nothing. Then 2 million gallons burned just to deny us. What are we doing here?" Across the Ardennes, U.S. engineers torched dumps to prevent capture. 1.1 million gallons at Trois Ponts, 2.5 million at Spa. In the first week alone, they destroyed more than 8 million gallons on purpose. That waste rested on a supply web Germans couldn't imagine. The Red Ball Express, 6,000 trucks running non-stop, had delivered 412,000 tons. Each truck drank 40 gallons a day. The trucking alone burned more fuel than Army Group B received monthly. By December 1944, 230 truck companies ran color-coded routes delivering 20,000 tons a day, including 3,000 tons of fuel. First Army Logistics Chief Colonel James Snyder noted on December 18th, "Yesterday, 147,000 gallons received, 123,000 issued, reserves up 224,000. Pipelines impressed even more. Under PLUTO, undersea lines pumped 1 million gallons a day from Britain. Inland, Cherbourg, Paris, moved 800,000 daily. The Seine line, 650,000. In December, the Allies in Northwest Europe used 7.5 million gallons per day and still received 8.2 million building stock while attacking. As Peiper drove deeper on December 18th, Germany's predicament was obvious. At Cheneux, they seized another dump. They burned 5,000 gallons in 3 hours of fighting. Tigers drank 2.5 gallons per mile in combat. Panthers, 1.5. Ardennes terrain pushed usage up 40%. Otto Dingler, maintenance officer for 1st SS Panzer Regiment, wrote, "By noon on the 18th, we had used 67,000 gallons since we started. We had captured maybe 55,000. We were in the red." The Americans, reading German radio via Ultra, knew Peiper's fuel state. General Courtney Hodges ordered, "Enemy critically short of fuel, destroy all gasoline at risk." That day, C-47s flew 316 sorties to Bastogne, including 160,000 gallons of fuel, more than Peiper's whole Kampfgruppe had on hand. On December 19th, as Peiper hit Stumont's defenders, the crisis peaked. Tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel, not damage. Peiper pooled what remained, perhaps 8,000 gallons, enough for one fight or one withdrawal, not both. Allied planners were already thinking ahead. Brigadier General Morris Gilland requested 245 million gallons for January, approved without debate. The difference wasn't only volume. American vehicles were standardized for efficiency. Shermans averaged about 0.8 gallons per mile. Tigers, 2.5. Loaded U.S. trucks got 8 miles per gallon. Parts were interchangeable, maintenance simpler. German units ran a messy mix of captured and domestic machines with clashing needs. French tanks wanted one oil, Panthers another. Soviet trucks needed different spares than Opels. Every variation multiplied the strain. On December 20th, Peiper received a radio. Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply. Continue with what you have. He gathered his officers. Sturmbannführer Vera Pertke said flatly, "Fuel for maybe 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30. Adjutant Hans Grüller recalled Peiper saying, "Gentlemen, we fight an enemy who burns more gasoline to deny us than we have received for this entire operation. What felt like a miracle at Honsfeld was nothing to them. We cannot win." The thought spread. General Hasso von Manteuffel later wrote, "When I learned the Americans had burned 8 million gallons rather than risk capture, I knew the offensive was finished before it started." Colonel Friedrich von Onde, captured on December 23rd, told interrogators, "Your troops throw away chocolate. Mine haven't seen any in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure by liters. How do we fight that?" December 21, La Glaise. By the 21st, Peiper was encircled at La Glaise. His tanks could no longer move. The American units closing the ring, the 30th Infantry Division, the 8th 2nd Airborne, and the 3rd Armored, had fuel allocations of roughly 340,000 gallons for that day alone. Peiper had perhaps 1,000. Private Richard McKinney wrote home, "We've got Krauts penned up who ran out of gas. The captain jokes we burn more heating coffee than they have for tanks." The U.S. answer was industrial war at full stride. Patton's Third Army pivoted north in 3 days, a redeployment that alone cost 350,000 gallons, considered impossible by German standards, executed as routine. December 23rd, clear skies. The weather lifted and Allied aircraft stormed the air, flying about 2,000 sorties. Fuel burned that day would have grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks. P-47s drank roughly 300 gallons an hour, B-26 about 200. 1 day of Allied flying consumed more than Germany's entire offensive ration. Night of December 23-24. Peiper ordered the vehicles abandoned and led his men out on foot. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that began the drive, 39 were still mechanically sound, but immobile, and were blown in place with remaining ammunition. An operations officer recalled, "We drained the last drops from everything, maybe 200 gallons in all. The Obersturmbannführer personally destroyed his command tank. Millions of Reichsmarks and equipment were lost to empty fuel tanks. Roughly 770 of the 5,000 who had started with Kampfgruppe Peiper made it back. They had pushed 60 miles, seized several depots, and learned the hard truth of Allied logistics. The story raced through German headquarters. On December 26, Field Marshal Walter Model read reports listing American stocks: 50,000 gallons seized at Honsfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed elsewhere rather than captured. He read the totals twice and said, "We are not fighting the same war." Hitler was briefed on December 28th and rejected the numbers. Speer later wrote that Hitler called them propaganda. When shown photos of the Stavelot Inferno, he dismissed them as Hollywood. The ranks understood. NCO Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote home, "The Americans use more in a day than we receive in a month. They ride tanks, we march. This war is lost." The larger picture. Fuel was only the most visible symptom. By 1944, the United States was producing around half the world's armaments. An airplane every 5 minutes, a ship a day, a tank every 7 minutes. Oil figures were brutal. U.S. 1.8 billion barrels, USSR 110 million, Germany, including synthetic, 33 million, Japan 2.6 million. The entire Axis pumped less than 2% of America's petroleum. After 1942, every major German offensive came with a fuel ceiling. American operations rode on surplus. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded a telling a scene on December 27th. A logistics officer reported weather had cut deliveries to only 500,000 gallons that day. Concern flickered until someone noted that was more than Germany's entire offensive allotment. For captured Germans, U.S. waste shocked more than firepower. Watching GIs toss half-eaten rations or burn gasoline for warmth broke morale faster than artillery. One POW said, "We knew your production on paper. Seeing soldiers waste more than we possessed made it real. Anyone who saw that abundance knew the war was hopeless. Censorship couldn't stop the news." A field marshal wrote, "Americans wash clothes in gasoline, feed dogs chocolate, fire salutes for Christmas. We cannot fight forever." The myth of American softness collapsed on contact with American logistics. At Nuremberg, German leaders kept returning to the same point. Logistics, especially fuel, decided the war. Field Marshal Keitel said, "We had operational superiority in 1940-41. In 1944, we could not move while the Americans shifted armies like chessmen." On trial for Malmedy, Peiper testified, "After the 17th, fuel dictated everything. We couldn't maneuver, pursue, or withdraw effectively. They moved freely while we counted leaders." General Heinz Guderian put it bluntly, when Peiper captured 50,000 gallons, everything to him, nothing to the Americans, the war was over. Historian Richard Overy later quantified it. By 1944, Allied to Axis output ran roughly 5.1 in key categories. In petroleum, nearly 50.1. No amount of training or tactical skill could offset that. America built 324,150 aircraft to Germany's $119,000, 80 F-410 U.S. tanks to 46,157 German. Most telling, the U.S. refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944. Germany scraped together 33 million. December 24th. As Peiper's men slipped out on foot, leaving 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the scale was undeniable. 50,000 gallons, celebrated that morning like a lottery win, meant nothing against an enemy who could burn millions to deny it. It was less than a U.S. armored division used in 2 days, less than the Red Ball Express burned in 3 hours. Just a rounding error in Allied daily consumption. Major General J. Lawton Collins later wrote, "The Germans assumed we valued gasoline as they did, irreplaceable. They could not grasp we had so much we would destroy millions rather than accept a tactical risk." Watch on the Rhine broke on the arithmetic of industrial war. Germany spent about 2.8 million gallons, roughly 40% of its allocation, while the Americans burned 267 million in the same span, nearly 100-fold more. The Wehrmacht lost about 100,000 men, 800 tanks, 1,000 aircraft, and, worst of all, its illusions. Any German who saw American plenty realized Germany wasn't waging a war so much as witnessing its own execution. Peiper survived, served time for war crimes until 1956, and was murdered in France on July 14, 1976. In 1967, he told historian Henry Lehman, "Finding that depot was the worst moment. We might have withdrawn with dignity had we faced reality sooner. Instead, we learned the Americans had oceans while we had drops. We discovered the impossibility." The lesson: industrial war turns tactics into logistics. Production overwhelms bravery. Abundance beats devotion. The German soldier of 1944 may have been better trained and more seasoned. It didn't matter. American industry dwarfed German output. That truth was stamped on every can at Honsfeld, every gallon burned at Stavelot, every pipeline across France. Wars between industrial powers are settled by factories and refineries, not by brilliant maneuvers. Colonel Trevor Dupuy calculated that in December 1944, each American soldier drew about 67 pounds of supply daily. Each German, 3. Americans griped about waste. Germans would have found U.S. waste unimaginable. 40 years later, in 1984, veterans met at La Glaise. Peiper's Tiger still sits there, the tank that ran dry on December 23rd. Former loader Carl Fortman stood beside it with Roy Anderson of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. Anderson asked, "Why did you stop?" "We thought it was tactical." Fortman laughed bitterly. "We stopped because the tanks were empty. You burned millions to keep it from us. How could we fight that?" Anderson paused and said, "We didn't know you had so little. We had so much we never thought about it." Their exchange captured the month's truth. One side counted in gallons, the other in millions. One fought for every can, the other burned oceans. The ending was pre-written. The paperwork says the same. Army Group B's Diary, December 1944. 16. Deck. Offensive begins. Fuel at 70% of minimum. 17 Deck. Peiper seizes 50,000 gallons. 18 Deck. Multiple depots destroyed, 5+ million lost. 19 Deck. Units halted for lack of fuel. 24 Deck. Peiper abandons vehicles. No fuel. First U.S. Army notes for the same period. 16 Deck. Reserves at 3.7 million gallons. 17 Deck. 2 million destroyed to prevent capture. 18 Deck. 1.8 million received. 24 Deck. Reserves 4.1 million. Americans treated millions casually. Germans guarded single cans. Quality mattered too. U.S. refineries used catalytic cracking to yield higher octane than German hydrogenation. American 100-octane avgas gave aircraft performance Germany couldn't match on 87-octane synthetic. U.S. additives like tetraethyl lead and detergent packages had no German equivalents. Engines tuned for low-grade fuel often ran poorly on captured American gas. Fuel shortage touched everything. On December 20th, Gerhard Hans Müller marched 30 kilometers because there was no gasoline for trucks. Passing abandoned American vehicles left idling for warmth. Ambulances couldn't evacuate. Hospitals struggled to power generators. Dr. Wilhelm Kirsting later said, We had excellent surgeons and captured U.S. supplies, but no fuel for ambulances. Men died who could have been saved with a 10-kilometer ride. The reality shattered propaganda about American weakness. Soldiers told that Americans were soft and inept now saw the opposite. The U.S. could destroy more than Germany owned. Goebbels noted rising morale problems as troops wrote home about American superiority. The myth of German invincibility couldn't survive contact with U.S. logistics. Aftermath. The Ardennes failure forced Germany into desperate defense. At Nuremberg, General Jodl said, "After the Ardennes, we knew it was finished. We played our last card and found the enemy held all the trumps." The Allies pressed the advantage, smashing what remained of German fuel production. By February 1945, output had stopped. The Luftwaffe was grounded, training ended, the Wehrmacht went static and was crushed by mobile forces. Spring brought surreal scenes. Panzer divisions surrendering because they couldn't move. Major General Fritz Böhme wrote, "We had 42 serviceable tanks, veteran crews, ammunition, and 300 liters of fuel, not enough for the next town. We destroyed the tanks and marched into captivity." The U.S. advance, by contrast, bogged only in traffic. Third Army alone ran 15,000 vehicles. Kampfgruppe Peiper's fuel crisis shows how industrial capacity decided World War II. Standing under those captured cans at Honsfeld, Peiper understood the enemy's waste exceeded Germany's needs. The math said it all. German offensive allotment, 5 million gallons. American fuel burned to deny capture, 8 million. Allied daily use, 7.5 million. Peiper's haul, $50,000, just 0.6% of one day's Allied demand. The Ardennes cost roughly 19,000 American and $100,000 German dead, and it wrecked the Wehrmacht's last reserves. Its deeper lesson was what Germans learned. U.S. abundance was beyond imagining. Honsfeld was not merely about fuel. It exposed the rules of industrial war. Victory belongs to the side that makes the most oil, steel, and aluminum. Germany never had a chance. Final irony. At La Gleize, U.S. recovery teams cataloged the German equipment left behind, 39 intact tanks, abandoned purely for lack of fuel. Major Robert Harrison's salvage note read, "Fuel required 8,000 gallons, priority minimal. Source, local reserves. Time, 4 hours." What Germans could not do, find 8,000 gallons to save their best armor, barely registered to Americans. That was Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld. America didn't just have more fuel. It had so much that German scarcity no longer mattered. The war ended when American industry mobilized. Honsfeld simply made the truth visible. Germany was attempting the impossible, measuring defeat in gallons while America measured victory in oceans. The tiger that ran dry at La Gleize stands in the museum today, a monument to tactical skill beaten by logistics. Visitors ask why such a formidable tank was left. The answer is still the simplest: no fuel.